Hello everybody, welcome to UK Gaming Network and another episode of Retro Game Super Leagues. I'm Brian, also known as UKGN Zoidberg, and I've played a lot of Amiga games. I'm here once again to rank all of the Amiga games in a selected category, the ones that I've played at least, and this month that category is vertical scrolling shooters. Now, I'm not in any way trying to claim that this is a definitive list, it's merely my own opinion as to which games you should be playing and which ones you shouldn't. Please don't get upset if I don't like the same games as you. If there is a specific category of games that you'd like to see me cover in a future episode of this series, please let me know in the comments and I will try to oblige in a future episode. Without further ado though, let's get to this month's ranking.
Right, so here we go. I have my list on the desk next to me. They've got 47 of these games to go through. Going to be ranking them in one of these 5 categories of essential, recommended, good, poor or rubbish. And as I've got so many of them to get through, let's just crack on with it. So first game is 1943, The Battle of Midway. This came out in 1989. The Amiga version was developed by Probe Software and published by US Gold under their Go label. I've always felt that the arcade version of this game in the first place, before we even got to the conversion, was a bit of a step down from 1942. I definitely prefer that game, and I didn't really like the switch from single hit kills to a health bar instead. I didn't think that fit the game. As conversions go though, this one is pretty poor, with really bad graphics, sluggish controls and repetitive gameplay. So I am going to stick this one in the poor category. Next up we have another arcade conversion. This is Action Fighter, came out in 1988, Amiga version programmed by Core Design. This is based on a Sega arcade machine. I found it to be a fast, fun and challenging Spy Hunter variant, which I had a lot of fun with, or at least I did for the first half of the game anyway. If you get good at the game, you'll eventually get to a point where you jump off the road into the sky and your vehicle morphs into a plane, and the game just becomes really boring and tedious at that point. But I don't think it's bad enough to go in the poor category, so I am going to stick this one in the good, but no higher than that. Next up we have Air Supply, which came out in 1990 from Magic Bytes, and this is an incredibly purple shooter where the idea of having a single coloured background works really well for the flying enemies as they stand out, but anything on the ground you simply cannot see. It also makes it look very boring overall, even though everything is fast and smooth. I could have also done without the helpful advice that the game dishes out after every death, as I'm pretty sure I was trying to avoid enemy shots. It's not a terrible game in the grand scheme of things, so it's not going right down at the bottom, but it is going to go in the poor category, as it's not one that you'll remember, and I think I am going to put this one just above 1943. Next up we have Apache Flight, which came out in 1992 from Atlantis Software, and this is the first of many budget titles that are going to appear in this list. This came from a developer called Mind's Eye. Like a lot of budget releases, this one has an air of that'll do about it. The graphics and sound are barely above 8-bit quality, and the movement of everything is incredibly slow. I also found that your helicopter and the enemies are so big on screen that avoiding the enemy bullets is far too difficult. So this is going to be another one that goes in the poor category. In fact, no, I think I'm going to drop this one right down into the bottom. I'm going to put it in the rubbish, as it's definitely worse than the 2 games I've put in the poor category. Next up we have a game that came out in the year 2000 called Apono Sin. That came from a developer called Level 1 Entertainment, and this is a very good looking shooter with a lot of nice touches throughout, but it's ultimately let down by some really poor design choices. The power-up system I found to have too many weapons that are essentially useless. Many of them end up with your shots having to be far too accurate to take out the enemies. It's nice that the developers put in there the ability to play through the levels in any order that you desire and at any difficulty. But I still found myself getting annoyed with it if I played for a long period of time, so definitely not better than good. But I think I'm going to put this one just above Action Fighter. Next up, we have Banshee, which came out in 1994, A1200 and CD32 only. This was developed and published by Core Design. It has one of the most ridiculous stories that you can imagine, but ignore that story and instead just concentrate on the brilliant graphics that the game has. For my liking, the levels in it, though, do tend to go on a little bit too long, because the first level went on for well over 10 minutes, which is far too long in my opinion. There are at least 3 sub-bosses on the first level, and if you'd broken it up by making those actual end-of-level bosses, I think you would have had a much better game overall. It's got a really good 2-player mode, though, even if that does end up making the screen a little bit too cluttered. But ultimately, I think for all its good looks and playability, it's not a very exciting game overall. And I think that's what stops it from going in the essential category, but it's definitely one that I would recommend, so into the recommended category you go. Next up, we have Battle Squadron, which came out in 1989, developed by Enterprise and published in the UK by Electronic Zoo. This is an absolutely brilliant slice of arcade action, with graphics and music that wouldn't feel place out of an arcade. I suppose if the game does have any flaws, you could argue that it's too hard to get your favourite power-ups at the start, and if you die in the first minute, you might as well quit and restart. One thing it does have, though, is great replayability, thanks to the fact that it provides the player with a choice of routes that they can take throughout the game, and it's got a really good variety of weapons. This is definitely, for me, the first one that's going to go in the essential category. This is one that everybody should play. Next, we have Black Hornet, another budget game, this time from High Tech Software, released in 1991. It's another low-effort, 8-bit looking shooter, but I suppose it is playable enough. It's lacking anything, though, that would make it in any way memorable. The ability to change your altitude is a good idea in theory, but it's one that doesn't really work in practice. Probably the biggest nail in the coffin for the game is the fact that it slows down way too much when a lot is happening on screen. So that's going to relegate it into the rubbish category, and I think I'm going to put it below Apache Flight. Next, we have Bomber Bob, which came out in 1990 from Italian developer Idea Software. This is a solid and enjoyable cartoon-looking shooter, but unfortunately, the gameplay isn't quite up to the quality of the visuals. It does have some very nice 3D sections that are interspersed throughout the game, if you can actually get to them. What I found to be a problem is the fact that it's not always obvious what enemies you can shoot and which ones require you to drop a bomb on them. But I think there is enough here for it to be one that makes it worth playing. So I am going to put this one in the good category, and I think I'm going to put it above the 2 games that are in there already. Next, we have a game called Bridge Strike, which came out in 2019, developed by Project R3D. This is a solid and enjoyable adaptation of Activision's River Raid, and the first of 2 games in this list that are going to be doing that. It's got really good colourful presentation that makes everything clear, even when the action is at its most frantic. The gameplay is, because it's based on such an old game, though, the gameplay is quite basic in the long run, but there's definitely enough here to make it one that I would put in the recommended. So I'm going to put this one below Banshee, but I think if you're a River Raid fan, you should definitely play it. Next up, we have Dragon Spirit, which came out in 1989 from Domark and a developer called Consult Software. This is an awful arcade conversion with washed out colours that probably gives away the fact that it was a direct conversion from the Atari ST. It should honestly be a crime to make a game where you're controlling a 3-headed dragon and it ends up being this boring. The gameplay is achingly slow, unless you play it on an A1200 where it's suddenly way too fast, and the enemies are utterly forgettable, pretty much like the game itself. So this one is going to go in the poor category. In fact, no, it's going to go right down in the rubbish category, and I am going to put it below the 2 games that are in there already. Just leave that one alone. Next up, we have Flying Shark, which came out in 1988, developed by Images Software and published by Firebird. This is a pretty decent conversion of the Toplan arcade original, but still not quite as good as the Spectrum version that was made by Graphgold. It is also a pretty tough game until you actually settle into its rhythm. It's got good graphics though, where everything is clearly presented and the scrolling is actually very smooth. There is a lot here to enjoy. There's also an unofficial new version of this game on its way that has a downloadable demo, which if that had come out already, that would place a lot higher than this one is going to. So I am going to put this one in the good category, and I think I'm going to put it just below Bomber Bob. Next up, we have Foundations Waste, which came out in 1988 from Exocet Software. This is a really frustrating shooter where the player ship is way too big to maneuver successfully around the screen. Enemies can kill you before you've even seen them on way too many occasions, and a lot of them move far too fast as well. I also think that it should be considered a crime against gaming to have power-ups that reverse your controls. Even if the ones here do so for only a couple of seconds, it's still really annoying and it should be banned. So for me, I don't think there's anything in this one to make it worth playing, so it's going to go in the poor category. And I think I am going to put it just above 1943. Next up, we have Frenetic, which came out in 1991 from Core Design. This is a fairly decent effort from the developer that picks and chooses ideas from a number of other better games, but uses them quite well. It's one of those shooters where your chance of success disappears the moment that you lose any of your power-ups. A lot of the time, your ability to see the enemies against the background is pretty difficult, although that does improve from level 2 onwards. Not a great game, but definitely one that is enjoyable, so this is going to go in the good category as well. And I think I am going to put this one above Apono Sin. Next up, we have Gemini Wing, which came out in 1989, developed by Imagitech Software, and this was based on the Tecmo arcade game. And while we all know that gameplay is more important than graphics, and the truly awful graphics can still destroy a game, as this one proves. It uses a truly garish colour scheme, and it makes it difficult to see where your own ship is on screen on a number of occasions. The gameplay is just about smooth enough, but I didn't really understand the power-up system or want to learn it. So this one is going to go right down in the rubbish category, but I think I'm going to put it above the 3 games that are in there already. Next up, we have Gold Runner, which came out in 1987, published by Microdeal, and this was actually developed by Steve Back, who is actually quite prolific when it came to games during that era. It's kind of like a vertical scrolling version of Hewson's Uridium, although nowhere near that game's level of fun or challenge. It has really awful mouse controls, and there's no option to play with the joystick that I could find, which pretty much killed the game for me. It's also got no on-screen indication of where the enemies might be, so you can find yourself flying over nothing for long periods of time. I know a lot of people consider this one an Amiga classic from that time, but for me it can go no higher than the poor category, and I think I am going to put this one below Foundations Waste. And that brings us on to Gold Runner 2, which came out in 1989. Different developer this time, a guy called Timothy Purvis programmed this one, and somehow, even though the first game wasn't very good, it got a sequel. It has better graphics, it has joystick control, and it has an in-game scanner telling you where the enemies are, which were all things that I didn't like about the first game. I still wouldn't call it a good game though. The speech still sounds like the programmer recorded it himself, and the gameplay gets boring very, very quickly. So yes, it's an improvement over the first Gold Runner, but it's still poor in my opinion, and I am going to put this one above Foundations Waste. Next, we come to a game called Hybris, which is actually a prequel of sorts to Battle Squadron. This was published in 1988 by Discovery Software. It's got some decent presentation and really excellent music. Enemies stand out nicely against the well-realised backgrounds, and there's an enjoyable challenge to be had throughout the entire game. What holds it back a little though is that I found there to be a lack of extra weapons and power-ups that robs it of some long-term appeal. But it's definitely one that I would recommend you play, so I'm going to put this one in the recommended category, and I think I do actually prefer this one to Banshee, so I'm going to stick it above that one. Next we have Insanity Flight, which came out in 1987 from French developer Linel, published by Microdeal. It's very fast and smooth, but it's also incredibly basic. Was probably considered fine in 1987, but the genre has moved on a lot since then. Being able to adjust the speed of the scrolling by moving up and down is a nice touch to the gameplay. Ultimately, I found it to be pretty forgettable though, although there are definitely worse shooters on this list. I don't think I can put it anywhere other than the poor category, and I think I'm going to put this one above Gold Runner 2. Next we have a game called Intact. Came out in 1989 from a developer called Cross Technics. This is an aggressively average title with okay graphics, no more so than that, but it does have a really interesting power-up mechanic. What drags it down though is the really sluggish movement of your ship, and the extremely low fire rate. Even if you have an auto-fire joystick, it'll only fire like once every 2 or 3 seconds. Because the whole reason that that's a problem is, what's the point of a shooter where you can't move quick enough to evade the enemy fire and you can't shoot back quick enough? So I am going to put this one in the poor category, and it's going to go right at the top above Air Supply. Next up we have Kamakazi, which came out in 1990 from Codemasters. This is a shockingly poor effort though from Codemasters, where being able to see enemy bullets was clearly an afterthought in the development process. The play area is a tiny square in the middle of the screen and filled with 8-bit quality scenery and sprites. The only reason that I would suggest loading this game up is that it has some really good music provided by Alistair Brimble, as you would expect. But other than that, don't play this one at all. This one's going to go right down in the rubbish category, and I think I'm going to put it just below Apache Flight. Next up we have a game called Killing Machine, which came out in 1992 from Atlantis Software, and this is another budget shooter where it's difficult to see what's going on. But unlike Kamakazi, this is because the artist is actually trying to pack in too much colour and detail, in my opinion. There's nothing particularly memorable about the game though, but it is competently made at least. The only sound that you get though is music, as there are no spot effects whatsoever, and that's always going to be a problem for games like this. So I don't think it's quite terrible to go in the rubbish category, but it's not any better than poor, and I think I'm going to put this one just above Gold Runner. Next up we have Last Duel, which came out in 1989, published by US Gold, and this one was developed by Tiertex. It follows the bad arcade conversion notebook to the letter. Does it have half the screen taken up with a pointlessly distracting HUD? Yes, it does. Does it have graphics that are a far cry from the original but just about recognisable? Yes, it does. Is it developed by Tiertex? Yes. In fairness though, the developer has made a lot worse than this one, and the flying stages, when you get to them, are actually a lot better, but they're still not actually worth your time. Just try and play the arcade original if you can. So this one is probably not bad enough for rubbish, but I'm going to stick it in the poor category, and I'm going to put it just above 1943. Next up we have a game called Leatherneck, which came out in 1988. This one is developed by Steve Back once again. And the reason that this one is here and not in the run and gun shooter league that I did a couple of months ago is because the central character that you control never once turns to the side. So you could quite easily just replace that sprite with a helicopter and the game would be no different. There's no getting around the fact though that you will have the most enjoyment out of this game by having 2 or more players, as it seems that the game doesn't scale down the difficulty in any way if you're playing it on your own. Advancing more than about 3 screens into the game, if you're playing it solo, is far too difficult, and I just ended up wanting to throw my joystick out the window rather than carry on playing. So for me, I am going to put this one in the rubbish category, and I'm probably going to put it just below Gemini Wing. Next up we have Lethal XS, which came out in 1991 from Eclipse Software Design. It's a decent solid shooter with a great soundtrack, but the graphics are a little bit overly simplistic. This is actually the sequel to Wings of Death that's going to be coming up later on in the list. And like that game, it's got a really nice weapon system, although if you do lose those power-ups you stand little chance of progressing much further into the game. falls into the trap that many shooters do of filling the screen with enemies without any thought over whether or not you can actually avoid them. Still enjoyable though, so I am going to put this one in the recommended category, and I think I am going to put it just above Bridge Strike. Next up we have License to Kill, which came out in 1989, published by Domark from a developer called Quixel. And like most Bond games released in this era, this is a lazy tie-in released at the same time as the movie. It has a few cherry-picked sequences from the film turned into okay, at best, vertical scrolling shooters. You will probably find that, like me, you'll get very annoyed with the little Bond theme that plays at the start of every life after you've died, as it will happen on a regular basis. There are some levels that are better than others. I think the opening level is probably the best one, where you're flying the helicopter, but I can't really put this one any higher than the poor category, and I think I'm going to put this one below Insanity Fight. Next up we have Major Motion, which came out in 1988. This was developed by Timothy Purvis, who actually was the person who made Gold Runner 2. It is definitely a basic but also enjoyable version of Spy Hunter, and it randomizes the levels every time you play, which makes it a really good score-based arcade game. There's not an awful lot to it, admittedly, in the long term, but I did find myself having a lot of fun as I was playing it. The graphics also for 1988 are pretty reasonable, although the scrolling is perhaps a little bit too jerky. I am going to put this one in the good category, I think, and I'm going to put it just below Frenetic. Next we have a game called Mega Typhoon, which came out in 1996, and this one has great arcade-like gameplay that's incredibly smooth and fast, with a good selection of weapons to pick up. However, there's no getting away from the fact that the graphics in this one are shockingly bad in places. Whoever chose the colour scheme really made a huge error, as it's too hard to see what's going on most of the time. Your eyes will eventually adjust, but it's a real shame, as with better graphics this would have been a lot higher in the countdown. I am going to put this one at the bottom of the recommended category, as it's definitely there's definitely enough that's good about it to make it worth your while. Next up we have a game called Mystical, which came out in 1990 from Infogrames, and there aren't many fantasy shooters out there, so that certainly makes this one stand out and makes it somewhat unique. It's got really fantastic arcade graphics. It's got some really fantastic cartoon graphics and a huge number of humorous spells with which you can use to take out the enemies. I still don't really understand how the gameplay works, despite the fact that I have played it quite a few times. And running out of firepower is just a really silly gameplay mechanic that they shouldn't have bothered with, and it spoils it. It's definitely not bad enough to go down into the poor category though, so I am going to put this one in good, but I think I'm going to put this one just below Apono Sin. Next up we come to a game called Outlands, which came out in 1989. From a developer called Bizarre, and this reminded me a lot of a number of the Spectrum shooters that I played back in the day, both in terms of its looks and gameplay. This is, of course, not a problem, as there are many Spectrum games that I'd happily still play today. Unfortunately though, this is just way too slow, and the fact that it then slows down even further when a lot is happening on screen is just ridiculous, and it ends up making your own fire rate almost non-existent, and that really kills the game completely. So for me, that's going to drop this one into the poor category, and I think I am going to put this one just below Foundation's Waste. Next up we have ReShoot 3 Proxima, a game that was released just last year, 2023, from a German developer called Spielschreiber. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It's got really great arcade-style gameplay, with great power-ups and challenging gameplay. I actually had to play this one on Antstream, where you can also play the previous two games in the series, which are both side-scrolling shooters, not vertical ones. Visually, it can look a little bit overwhelming at times, and that drags it down a little. But it's a great example of what the Amiga is capable of. I was actually also a really big fan of the way that the game only gives you one life, and basically every time you take a hit you lose the power, but you don't die. And I think that worked really, really well in this case. So I am going to stick this one in the essential category. Definitely should be playing this one if you like shooters, but I think Battle Squadron is just better. Next up, we have River Raid Reloaded, which came out in 2019, and this is another decent version of the Atari 2600 Classic, even if it doesn't look anywhere near as nice as Bridge Strike. I found that it does actually play slightly better, though, as it's got a more traditional shooting method and really challenging gameplay. In the original River Raid and in Bridge Strike, when you fire your weapons, those weapons then move with your ship. And that doesn't happen here, and that just makes it more enjoyable all around. I would have preferred sound effects though, as the music that plays throughout does actually begin to grate after a while. I am actually going to put this one in the recommended category, and I think I'm going to put it just above Bridge Strike. Next up, we have Scramble Spirits, which came out in 1990, published by Grand Slam and developed by Tech Software. This is a really poor conversion of a little-known Sega arcade game. I'm pretty sure that the arcade original wouldn't have looked and played like something that was made in the shoot-'em-up construction kit. I mean, the graphics are already pretty terrible, but for some reason it has a really bizarre bonus stage that zooms in on them and just shows off just how bad they really are. There's not a lot about this game that makes it worth playing in any way, so like a lot of the arcade conversions on this list, it's going to go pretty low down, and I think it's going to go in the rubbish category, and I'm going to put it just below Gemini Wing. Next up, we have Screaming Wings, which came out in 1987 from Red Rat Software. Even Scramble Spirits managed to look better than this one. No amount of audio samples from Aliens can rescue this one. It's an incredibly basic shooter with repetitive enemies and badly drawn scenery. It's honestly hard to believe that this is from the same developer who 1 year later would make Lombard RAC Rally. Just forget this game exists. I'm going to put this one in the rubbish category, and I'm going to put it just down at the bottom, just above Dragon Spirit. Next, we have a game called Sidewinder, which came out in 1988 from Synergistic Software, published by Mastertronic. The graphics in this one aren't especially good, but it does have some really nice explosions, and the gameplay more than makes up for how basic the graphics are. Power-ups don't seem to come often enough though, and I've seen a lot of people saying in comments on various websites that this one is not bad for a budget title, but as we've already seen in this league so far, it's actually not bad regardless of what price it was released at, and it's certainly better than all the budget titles that I've covered so far. I think I'm going to put this one in the good category, as you should really look past the graphics and just play it, and I think I'm going to put this one just above Mystical. Next up, we have Sidewinder 2, which came out the following year from PAL Developments, and apart from a ship that looks slightly similar to the one in the first game, you wouldn't really believe that this is the same series at all. The gameplay is nowhere near as enjoyable, with tight walled-in sections and poor manoeuvrability. It's got really amateurish graphics and bad sound all round, which makes the package best left forgotten, in my opinion. I'm going to put this one at the top of the rubbish category, just above Gemini Wing. And next up, we have another game from Codemasters called Sky High Stuntman, released in 1991. But this one is definitely a far superior effort to Kamakazi. It's actually a halfway decent Flying Shark clone with okay graphics, even if it is excessively brown in places, and a lot of the gun placements do tend to blend into the background. It's also, unfortunately, one of those games that mistakes throwing more enemies at you for a difficulty curve, but compared to the other budget games on this list, it's definitely one that's worth playing more than any of them, and I think I will actually put this one right at the bottom of the good category, just below Action Fighter. Next up, we have Sonic Boom. Came out in 1990 from Activision, developed by Source, and this is a much better conversion of a Sega arcade shooter. Much better than Scramble Spirits for definite, but still not something that I would call good. It's essentially the same game as Scramble Spirits, as it features a lot of the same power-ups. It's just this one is more modern jet fighters rather than propeller ones. It really does need more colour in the presentation though, as the bullets are far too hard to see at times. Overall, the graphics are fairly bland, and the music really starts to get on your nerves after a while. I don't think it's quite bad enough though to drop it right down into the rubbish category, so I am going to put this one in poor, and that's getting quite crowded in there, but I'm going to put this one just above Foundation's waste. Next up, we have The Spy Who Loved Me, which came out in 1990, developed by the Kremlin and published by Domark. And let's just get this one out of the way. This was a really great idea to take the Lotus versus helicopter chase from the movie and turn it into a Spy Hunter clone. Where it unfortunately falters a little bit though is in the actual design of the game itself, as there's admittedly not a lot of shooting to it, and the speed means that you can only see about 5 meters in front of your car, which when you're trying to navigate through tight twisting turns is pretty tricky. The biggest problem for me though is the fact that every time you die you are returned all the way back to the start of the level, no matter how far you got, and that's always something that annoys me. But I don't think it's enough to drop it down into the poor category, and I think I'm going to put this one just below Action Fighter. Next up, we have Star Goose, which came out in 1988 from developer Logotron. It's got a really interesting concept with levels that resemble Marble Madness, and the way that your craft reacts to the angle of those levels is really nice. It's got good graphics all around, admittedly, with some great looking 3D tunnel sections that are interspersed throughout the levels, which you use to gain extra ammo and shield. The gameplay is ultimately though a little bit annoying, with enemies feeling a little bit OP, and that's going to drop it down to the bottom of the good category, and I think I'm going to put this one below Sky High Stuntman. Next up, we have SWIV, which came out in 1991, developed by Random Access Software and published by Storm the Sales Curve. There is no question that the way that this game loads the level as you play, making the game essentially one long level, is really technically impressive. Although, unfortunately, I would actually prefer it if it had a more traditional level structure, as it tends to get a little bit boring after a while. It does, however, look really, really good, with great sprites and nicely detailed backgrounds, and it's got a number of well-designed enemies. The 2-player mode also can be a lot of fun, although there will always be fights between you and your friends over who gets to be player 1, as controlling the helicopter is a lot better than playing as the Jeep. I know this is going to divide a lot of people over where I place this one, but I think I'm going to put this one in the recommended category, not the essential, and I think I'm going to put this one just below Banshee. Next up, we have a game called Violator, which is yet another game from Codemasters, released in 1991. And you could always count on Codemasters to shamelessly rip off other titles that had just come out. And this time their target was SWIV. It has better graphics than Sky High Stuntman, and it has really good music by Matthew Simmons, but it's really not that much fun to play at all. The power-ups, when they do come, don't last long enough, and many of the attack waves from the enemies are impossible to avoid flying into. So this one is going to go in the poor category, and I think I'm going to put this one just above Killing Machine. Next, we have Wings of Death, which came out in 1989 from Eclipse Software, and like I said before, this is the prequel to Lethal Excess. It makes a refreshing change to be flying over fantasy castles rather than generic jungles and deserts. The gameplay does feel a little bit clunky overall, but it's also really good fun with excellent graphics and music throughout. The power-ups all offer something a little bit different, meaning that you've got a nice level of variety to the gameplay, so that you'll want to come back and play it over and over again. And I think this one is definitely going to go in the recommended category. And I think I'm going to put this one just above Banshee. It's definitely one that you should be playing. Next, we have Zenon, which came out in 1988 from the Bitmap Brothers. This one was published by Melbourne House. Easily one of the most enjoyable shooters out there. And I think I actually prefer this one to the sequel. Spoilers. I love the way that you can change between the air and the ground at any time, as it allows you to tackle the levels at your own pace and be a little bit more strategic in your approach. The graphics have an excellent clarity to them, and they were definitely an early showcase for the Bitmap Brothers style. An auto fire joystick is definitely recommended though, in order to get the most out of the game. And for me, this one's going to go in the essential category, but I think I'm going to put it below the 2 games that are in there already. And now we come to Zenon 2 Mega Blast, which came out in 1989. Once again, designed by the Bitmap brothers, but actually programmed by the assembly line. This is definitely one of the most memorable shooters on the Amiga, and that's not just for the Bomb the Base soundtrack. The graphics are still just as good today as they were when the game was released, but I've always felt that the gameplay in this one is a little bit of a letdown after the first game, as unless you have an auto-fire joystick, you don't really stand any chance of survival whatsoever. Also, I really didn't like the fact that some of the levels are effectively a maze, meaning that you can actually get stuck and you then have to back up incredibly slowly, which was incredibly annoying. And that, for me, drops this one into the recommended category rather than the essential. And I think I am going to put this one just below SWIV. Next, we have ZVS 1200, which came out in 2023 from developer JOTD. I really like how the Amiga is getting a lot of almost arcade perfect conversions of classic games in recent years. JOTD has made a number of them: Pac-Man, Amidar, Bagman and Scramble, to name a few. So if you're a fan of the arcade version of ZVS, then you're absolutely going to love this version, as it also includes Super ZVS. For me though, I was never that much of a fan of the original, as it feels a little bit dated by today's standards. So it's still enjoyable and definitely a 100% accurate conversion. So, but for me, it can't go anywhere higher than the good category. And I think I'm going to put this one just above Frenetic. And then for the final game, we have XP8, which came out in 1996 from Weathermain Software. And this is this feels to me like an attempt to emulate the look and style of Stardust, although it doesn't really work here, as there are some really questionable colour choices, especially if you play the A500 version. It ultimately feels a little bit cheap and nasty as well, as if it needed a little bit more time in development to polish it before release. It is still enjoyable though if you do like shoot 'em ups, but I don't think I can put it any higher than the good category. So that's where it's going, and I think I'm going to put this one. It's definitely better than Apono Sin. I think I'm going to put this one just below Frenetic. So there you go. That's 47 vertical scrolling shooters on the Amiga ranked. There are going to be some games that I have not included simply because I either couldn't get them to work or have never played them, and I also decided not to include any of the many creations that were made with the shoot 'em up construction kit, as they're all pretty much the same and not very good, and they were all public domain releases anyway. But if you disagree with any of the placements that you see here, please do let me know where you'd have placed them in the comments. I'll also put a link to the Tiermaker website in the video description if you want to go there and rank all these games yourself. If you do that, please do share them with me on social media. All the socials are in the description as well. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I will see you on the next Retro Game Super League next month. Until next time, happy retro gaming, and I'll see you soon.